Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second panel, or our first panel. We had a keynote speaker, Professor Kingsley, and I hope you were all able to attend his talk, which was very informative and extremely inspiring. We'll wait a few more minutes to see if everyone can join us, and then we'll start in a few seconds, unless my watch is off. Our panel today is entitled Why Use Gender Inclusive Language? My name's Atiyeh Showrai. I'm the director of the Basic Language Program here at USC. And on behalf of the USC Center for Languages and Cultures, I'd like to welcome all of our attendees and especially our distinguished guests. The format of the session is more of a discussion. So I will be asking questions of our panelists, and then hopefully we'll have a discussion that follows and we'll see where it leads us. Please do, it's a webinar, so you won't be able to interact orally with our panelists, but please put all of the questions that you have in the Q&A. And I also ask our panelists to kind of keep an eye out on the Q&A from time to time to see if there are any of those questions that you can address within your responses and our discussion. And otherwise, at the end of the session, we'll have time to address directly those questions and comments. The session is also, I'll remind you that the session is being recorded, and so you'll be able to view it again or also share it with any colleagues that you would want to do so with. I'll get us started with by presenting our panelists. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Benjamin Rifkin, or Ben Rifkin, who is Professor of Russian and Dean of Arts and Sciences at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Also by Joseph Parodi-Brown, who is Academic Dean of Modern Languages Department Chair and Director of SHIELD, Students Honoring Inclusion, Equity, Love, and Diversity, at the Marianapolis Preparatory School in Connecticut. Also by Lausche, who is Assistant Principal at the high school campus of the Larchmont Charter School in Los Angeles. And finally by Karrie Kingsley, who is Associate Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Faculty and Staff Success and Associate Professor of Clinical Occupational Therapy here at USC. Welcome to all of you. We're delighted to have you. Okay, so here I think you'll see there are a number of panelists, so a number of people are kind of, their view is not here, but those of us that you do see will be the ones who are participating. So you see Ben, you see Joseph, you see Lausche, and Karrie Kingsley. So we welcome you all. Let's start with the first question and kind of the big question, and also the crux of our discussion, which is why use gender inclusive language? This is the title of our panel, but I think it's really an important question to address. Would any of you like to lead off?
I'm happy to. Oh, please, go ahead.
Everyone will get a chance.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everyone. Honored and delighted to be here. You know, I'm working in the high school level. So for grades 9 through 12, for us at this particular age, students who are choosing to use maybe non-conforming pronouns and gender identities and such are experiencing a high rate of suicidal ideation and trauma and emotional disturbance if we're not recognizing the gender pronouns that they have chosen for themselves or have been chosen for them. So I think paramount for their safety, for their emotional safety, and that we as a school are providing a safe and secure learning environment for them. It's tantamount that we do that for our students so that they can then focus on learning, honoring their identity as much as we possibly can.
May I, before other panelists respond to the same question, may I just piggyback on Laurie's response, because she is the one amongst us who is within the K through 12 context. And it is a very complex situation, especially since you also deal with parental perspectives and their views. students who are minors. We primarily at the university level deal with adults, but you are dealing with minors, and there are also school policies. Can you address how all of that gets kind of addressed and worked out?
Yeah, I would say thankfully in California, the law is definitely on our side in protecting our students first and foremost. We are by law required to use the pronoun they have shared with us, the name they have shared with us. We let the student lead that charge in sharing that information with us. And we're currently, which is very exciting, in the process of more formalizing those processes and procedures for our students, making sure that we protect them at all times. And that includes using their pronouns and their name with them here at school, making sure that all staff are aware of that information, but also having the conversation with the student. Who else knows this information, and are you comfortable with us sharing? And we do walk that line of finding out, are your parents, because they're minors, are your parents or guardians aware? And if not, making sure we document and share that information also, so that, for example, during parent-teacher conferences, that we then use the legal name versus the chosen name or pronouns.
Right. And Laurie, we're joined by many K through 12 instructors from all over the states and also probably in other parts of the world. For teachers who work in states that are not as protected as we are in California, do you have any kind of suggestions, or can you offer any guidance?
Wow. I would lean heavily on whatever federal law can govern and guide you, because you don't necessarily have the state law supporting you. And always, it's the welfare of the children. We are in the business of caring for children. So letting that guide how you maneuver and operate within those states where maybe the law isn't on your side right now.
Thank you so much, Laurie. So Ben, coming back to you, thank you for waiting. And we digressed in a sense, but I think it's so important in the K through 12 realm to be able to address this question. Could you please speak to why we should use gender inclusive language?
Absolutely. I do want to tip my hat to Laurie and all of those K-12 educators who are navigating these issues in far more complicated contexts than we are in higher education, especially those educators in states that are aggressively promoting hate in their legislation. So here I'm going to be speaking now exclusively from my much safer perch, working in higher education in a vividly blue state that I believe very strongly in the importance of teaching in ways that are respectful of all aspects of our students' identities and being inclusive of the range of identities of speakers of the languages and residents of the cultures that we're teaching, for a few very important reasons. First, it's important, I believe, for all of us as educators to understand that every single student who comes into our classroom comes into that classroom with a range of intersecting identities. And each one of our students has multiple intersectional identities that they bring to the learning process, in which they need to be recognized, valued, and supported. I recognize that those of our colleagues who teach in the public sector of the K-12 educational system have to have gone through numerous pedagogical course requirements in child psychology, child development, and so forth. Whereas those of us who teach in higher education had to write a dissertation that may have been on 17th century Austrian female writers. Now, when I say this, I in no way wish to dismiss the importance of 17th century female Austrian writers. But that research project doesn't necessarily inform us about how to teach our language and our culture. Many of us are native speakers of the languages and cultures we teach. I am not one of those. I came to Russian as a second language learner. And ironically, I am far more comfortable teaching Russian than I am teaching English, because with English, I am reduced to just indicating this is right and that's not right, and I don't know why. You'll need to ask a professional. I have a mouthful of teeth, and yet you don't want me to be your dentist. I'm not trained to do that. And so most of us who teach at in the higher education context have had precious little training about teaching language. Although I have to say that the world language programs in graduate programs across the country have some of the most robust methods, components of any liberal arts disciplines. Just ask faculty who teach history about their training to teach history, or chemists, the same thing. That being said, we owe it to our students to teach them where they are and who they are, and they bring those identities into the room. It is, I believe, unethical to do otherwise. Secondly, we need to be mindful of the fact that every language and culture we teach has individuals in that culture who are native to that culture and guests of that culture who identify on the LGBTQI as members of the LGBTQI community, QIA community. We must not eliminate them from the view of our students of the language and culture they are studying. They are here, they are queer, and they count. They are part of the cultures we study. And then lastly, but not least, recognizing LGBTQIA people in our classroom and in the cultures, and using gender-inclusive language and teaching gender-inclusive language is also recognizing the fact that language changes. And in doing so, we are modeling acceptance of the fact that language changes. I don't know all the answers for how to address the language challenges that come from recognizing non-binariness in the teaching of the Russian language, which is intensely gendered, let alone the issues that my non-binary students and all of my LGBTQIA students will face when they go to a culture, specifically I'm talking about Russia now, that is culturally homophobic and transphobic and legally homophobic and transphobic. So I need to demonstrate my acceptance and respect in the classroom as a teacher and show them that even if I don't have all the answers, we will figure it out together. And these are all very important reasons for using gender-inclusive language. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Some interesting points that we'll come back on a little later in the discussion. Joseph, Karrie, would either of you like to address it? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. And I will, to save time, I won't echo what we heard from Lori and Ben. But a lot of my reasons are the same. I am also in a 9 through 12 setting. I'm in a little bit of a unique setting in that I'm at an independent school and I'm at a Catholic high school. And so while with an independent school, I have a little bit more independence, obviously, than some public schools may, but we do obviously have a religious context that is part of who we are. And so, you know, to speak a little bit to your question about those challenges, either legislatively in states that are restricting conversations about queer identities, you know, I'm not in such a state, but our religious context raises some challenges, right? And so one of the things that I have really leaned on in our language department is our mission statement. And I know not just independent schools have mission statements, many schools do. And so for us, you know, when we admitted our first openly non-binary student, and I use that openly intentionally, we as a school had to reflect on our practices and reflect on our policies. And so as a language department, we gathered and we decided that in every level of every language, we were going to offer our students inclusive non-gendered language. Now, as a non-native speaker of Spanish, I teach Spanish, and also as a cisgender male, so I am not a non-binary individual, right? I am relying on those communities in the target language for those options. And just as Dr. Nicely mentioned, in French, 56 options that he recognized or had come across, just as we know in English, there is not just one non-binary pronoun or way of speaking about oneself. There are multiple options in Spanish as well. And so looking at those and sharing those with our students has been important. And I just wanted to say, you know, as a high school teacher, relying a lot on the ACTFL standards of language education, right? To sort of build off what Ben was saying, right? If we look at those 5 C's of language learning, every single one of them is connected to the queer community. And so that is, as language instructors, the basis for why we should be teaching inclusive language.
Thank you. And Karrie, would you like to address the question and maybe discuss how we can also invite students into the conversation and how we can move from the cisnormative to gender affirming language?
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts, and thank you for having me. And also, I'm going to speak from kind of different perspectives here. So one from kind of like the diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, but also I am someone who is non-binary, so I can also share a little bit of that perspective. So gender inclusive language, the first thing from like a bigger picture diversity thing that I want to say is like, you know, what do we default to? And I'm not a linguist, just going to point that out. But as someone who, you know, in English, we default to the masculine, and I can name 2 other languages that I know do the same when we have mixed gendered groups, right? And so when we think about this in a bigger picture, it's like this is patriarchal, this is systemic, this is directly linked to upholding white supremacy and institutions of oppression. And that alone should be a reason for us to question the use of our language on a day-to-day basis. Now we also have communities that are marginalized and oppressed and are experiencing extreme mental health distress, not because there's anything inherent with our identity, but because of what we have to deal with every single day. And personally, I can tell you, depending on how many meetings I'm in a day, I am misgendered no less than 5 and probably up to 40 times a day, depending on what my daily interactions are like. And, you know, that takes a toll. It really does. I mean, I am a pretty self-aware, successful adult. And, you know, I hit a wall of identity burnout last semester. I was all done. I had to take a break. I took 2 weeks. I didn't see family. I did nothing. I did not want to interact in ways that were not going to be safe. And so I think it gets challenging because there's so much counter narrative and hate going on right now. And I can't underscore enough that it is very low hanging fruit to ask a community to change their language use, and the impact prevents death. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. Literally, the literature shows, I overlap with my K-12 colleagues. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, and I publish around these topics. And I just published around gender expansive youth. And for youth who are socially transitioning, that validation will save their life. The research is unequivocal. If I use your pronouns and your chosen name, it reduces suicide risk to the same level as their cisgender peers. So those are my big points and the big push. And the reality is also, I would share too, with adult learners in higher ed, I still ask those questions about where they're out. I think we assume that, you know, adult learners, they're adults and they're handling this, but what we know is a lot of high achieving folks delay social identity development because they focused on other things. And so we're still seeing a lot of identity work happening in higher ed. And so when my students, when I interact with my students, I ask it privately, you know, what name would you like me to use? What pronouns would you like me to use? And then there's a series of follow-up questions of, can I do this in class in front of others? Is this just during office hours and email communication? How would, you know, I am asking for those layers of consent because I don't want to, you know, transgress in some way. So I will end with that.
Thank you, Karrie. You brought up a really important point, and which is that also gender inclusive language is kind of a new world for many of us. I mean, it represents a learning process for us, me, myself, as an educator on an individual basis, and then for how I teach also. And especially as language educators, we're dealing with language. We're kind of in a particular position that's very different from teachers, educators who are teaching other subject matters like physics and math. So with the language, can anyone address that? I think a lot of language educators, for us, it's also a new language, especially in gender grammatical languages, not gender natural languages. It's complicated as what Professor Nicely showed this morning. There's so many pronouns, which ones do you use? We are actually needing to learn a different language, add on to our knowledge to be able to teach it. Could anyone address how you've dealt with that, how you feel, what your thoughts on that, please?
I would like to say something first in response and in support of what Karrie just said. And then I'll share something about my journey in terms of learning about these issues in Russian, which is an intensely gendered language. So Karrie, I just can't say enough how supportive I am of what you just said and how important it is for us to understand the high stakes component of this issue for many of our learners. You know, when I'm teaching verbs of motion or the genitive plural as a professor of Russian language, and my students are making mistakes in these very complicated grammatical structures, I reassure myself that ultimately they can make those mistakes for the rest of their lives, and they won't die from it. But actually making these other mistakes can contribute to this distress level. I'm talking about the misgendering people, the distress level of our learners so much that they it can lead them to self-harm. So this is truly high stakes and important. And so I'm so glad that USC is sponsoring this conference, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I do want to also point out that for many students in the context of higher education, the experience of being in a language classroom can be, with the right instructor, can be absolutely liberatory. Consider for a moment that many of our students in institutions of higher education are taking large classes that could have 100 or more students in the room. Teaching third-year Russian, I have had students come out for the first time in class because they feel the trust of the community. And I think there may be also some reduction of taboos in saying things not in English. In addition to having students come out in my class, I've had students openly discuss the fact that they've had an abortion and say, this is the first time I've told anyone. And I've had students tell each other they love each other in the classroom. And I set up my classroom always as a safe space where whatever we say in the class is not to be repeated elsewhere. It's, you know, it's confidential. And then that gives students the language class can be a haven if we commit ourselves to making it so. So now I'm going to shift Atiyeh to your question. So Russian presents significant challenges for being gender inclusive. And I just want to share just one of the most simple and basic ones. Years ago, I used to begin first-year Russian classes by saying hello and in Russian and shaking hands with people and gradually teaching them how to say hello, because they could understand that I was saying hello by virtue of the fact that I was walking around the room and saying hello. But I also used to ask students if they were a student or a professor. Now, asking the question, are you a student, requires the use of a gendered noun, either the word student or the word studentka. I also used to ask students if they were Americans. Amerikanец, male, Amerikanka, female. And a couple of years ago, it looked like I was going to be teaching first-year Russian again, and I wanted to readjust that pattern to be gender inclusive. And I posted a query to the listserv for Slavists. Folks, how are we doing this these days? I don't know. Help me find the information. And while I got some very helpful tips of where this information is available online from the LGBTQIA community of Russian speakers, I also got an avalanche of hate. And this came to me as a full professor and a dean, cisgendered white male, full of privilege, and it hurt. And it's like the tip of the iceberg of the hostility, the animosity, the venom that's being poured upon our LGBTQIA colleagues. And so I think that the answers for people who are looking for gender inclusive strategies for managing languaging, to use the term that Chris used, are out there for each of our language communities to be found. And I encourage everybody to reach out to people who might know the answers or might know someone who uses the answer. I was accused by some people in my field of seeking to change the Russian language, as if I could change the Russian language. And, my response to them was, there are people who identify as LGBTQIA, who are Russian speakers, who are using these forms. And so in respect of my students who identify as members of that community, I will use them too, and I will teach them to use them. And I will teach them to be aware of what it means to use them, especially in the context if they travel to Russia, where they will be exposed to greater risk of not only the venom of homophobia and transphobia, but potential violence as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And I'm going to pick up from there based also on a question of one of the attendees. Now, France is a lot more open and respectful and embracing of trans communities and LGBTQ and legally and everything else. And yet, in 2021, when the pronoun yel, which is the combination of il and elle, was included in the online Robert dictionary, it created a lot of noise. And when Brigitte Macron, who is the First Lady of France and an educator herself, having been the teacher of the President of France, was asked about this, she said very categorically, in French, we have two pronouns, il and elle, he and she, that's it. Then the Minister of Education has later been asked, and he said, no, there is no mid-dot in the future of French, and all of this new language will disappear. So even though France is obviously does not, or the French people within France do not deal at all with this issue the same ways that, it is in Russia, it is seen as an attack on the purity of language. And there is a lot of, and it's not as widely used. We in America have come to use it. It's partially because maybe it's a little easier with they, them, their. It's reappropriating a pronoun that exists in a different use. So it's been easier for everyone to use it. And it's a natural gender language, whereas French, like Russian, is a grammatical gender language, which adds complications for possessives, adjectives, everything else. So it is not commonly used in France. A lot less. I mean, a lot of people, I'm there in France all the time. There's some, you know, in the groups that where it's necessary, it is used and within their friends, but not in the general population. So one of the questions also of one of the attendees is how, when teaching gender inclusive language to students, what happens when they go to the country where that language is not used? And if all of you could address maybe how it is used in the cultures of the language that you do teach. Ben mentioned it for Russia, and we know that that's, you know, or for France, but also we do as instructors also have a responsibility, as you all put it, to keep our students safe and not, you know, so that when they do go to the country, they're using the language as it's used in the country. They are able to somehow assimilate into the language where they're understood with what they've used and they've been taught and they're using. Can you kind of address that question? Any one of you?
Yeah, certainly. I'll jump in for a moment. So I'm a Spanish educator, and in our school we teach both French and Spanish. And certainly, you know, one of the challenges of being a Spanish teacher is that there's not just one Spanish, but really about 25 different Spanishes spoken around the world, and certainly as I mentioned earlier, not being a native speaker of Spanish, I'm sensitive to complaints of sort of linguistic colonization or things of that nature. But what we do know is that within the queer communities in these Spanish-speaking countries, and I include the United States as a country with a large Spanish-speaking population, right? Within these queer communities, in these target language communities, they are being used, and sort of much as queer people do in their own languages, sort of this code switching that occurs and understanding sort of when to use queer coded language and when not to is an important aspect of that. Certainly we know that the governing bodies of the Spanish language, and that's the Real Academia Española and the 22, I think, other academias that exist around the world, have not yet embraced gender neutral language. And in some respects, they claim that they are not doing so because they are not out of a prescriptivist motive, but rather as descriptivists, right? And their claim is that as it is used more and more, as it enters into general usage, it will become part of the dictionary or whatever it is. And so encouraging students to understand where those terms are used, where this language is used. Argentina, for example, in the Spanish-speaking world, is where we see a lot of this queer language, this non-gendered language coming from, including the president of Argentina using it in speeches, and some institutions of higher learning accepting non-gendered language in their writing styles, and then the pushback to that, laws against allowing that. And certainly, so we see it in Argentina, we see it in Spain, and we see it in some of the more typically what we would consider open communities. But certainly understanding, that it isn't monolithic, right, is important for our language learners.
Right. It's always, it's a difficult one to navigate because we want to affirm and support our students here. And then it's when they go abroad also, what do they do and what do they use? And I was wondering also if you could address, which is the grammatical gendered languages. There's the part, as we mentioned, that we as educators also need to learn the pronouns and how it's done. And yet a lot of them are, and as Professor Nicely showed, this morning in his talk, there are like a number of different pronouns. There's something that emerges a bit more, but it's still a language that is in development, that it's a process. Can you speak to which ones do you teach? How do you teach? Especially, I'm thinking of basic language. So I know Ben mentioned teaching Russian 1. So, you know, you're already teaching, or at least in French, we teach the masculine, the feminine. Here we're adding another pronoun with all of the set of agreements, possessives, direct, indirect object pronouns that replace it, that is not fixed, you know, that's still in development. How do you maneuver that?
I'll just pipe in here and say that there are additional language challenges for expanding the content of what we're teaching to include non-binary forms. There's more words, more forms, more variables to think about. The research on language learning outcomes shows, and I'm going to just stick now to the higher education world. So forgive me, I don't know as much about the K-12 context. But in the higher education world, students who begin studying a language in college will achieve intermediate level proficiency after 4 years of classroom instruction if they don't go on study abroad for a semester or longer, regardless of the language they're studying. And if they go on study abroad for a semester or longer, they have to actually use the language while they're there. So it's another if. It's not enough to just be in Spain. You actually have to speak Spanish in Spain. So to that end, I want to reduce the pressure on language educators for this idea that I can't spend time on these non-binary forms because then I won't have enough time for the subjunctive or, you know, some other hypothetically important grammatical structure. Because at the end of the day, at the end of 4 years, they're still not going to be fluent speakers of the language we teach. And my argument here is, it's more important for them to have hearts, to be compassionate, to be respectful. We're all going to make mistakes. I make mistakes in English every day. I'm a native speaker with 2 degrees from an Ivy League institution. I still make mistakes in this language. So our students of Russian and Italian and Chinese and Arabic and French and Spanish are also going to make mistakes. Relax. Let's embrace teaching the non-binary forms because that's a journey to a much better destination than a hypothetical one that exists only in some people's fantasies, where students never make grammatical mistakes and have completely mastered the intricacies of every language we speak and teach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And I think that's an very interesting point you make, and an important point that you make, that, you know, there are certain things that are very, that students just gain some conceptual control of, like the subjunctive, and yet we spend a lot of time on, and that time can be spent then on issues and questions that are of more importance, such as the non-binary pronouns and gender inclusive pronouns and language, and that process could be, instead of 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever programs allowed to address certain points, would have to be lengthened and would take up from elsewhere. And I appreciated very much this morning when Chris nicely mentioned assessment, and the fact that assessment is a way of affirming this language. And so it needs to be assessed, which gives its place, which honors its place in the language because it is being assessed and shows students that it is important and something to be learned. So thank you very much. I think those all kind of work together as to how people could rethink their programs to be able to include and develop, put enough time to help students take in this new language and be able to use it, apply it for themselves and for others. There's also, and I was wondering about this, you know, we all need tools. So for example, in French, you know, you have the word for brother, you have the word for sister, and then now for the gender inclusive, there's a whole other word that has been kind of created as a combination of different words. And so there's a whole new vocabulary that teachers, educators also, who are not in the situation where it's needed for themselves, need to discover and learn to be able to use it. Can you speak to what you think as being resources that need to be developed? What kind of, you know, for example, the American Association of Teachers of French has a commission on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so they have created within one part a small web page with a number of resources that teachers can go to. Do you have any advice for people in different languages? I know we have Spanish represented, we have Russian represented at least, as to where educators could go to obtain the resources that they need, kind of in a more easy way to be able to prepare, to be able to be better educators. Anyone who could address this, Laurie, Joseph, Ben, Karrie.
Yeah, I'm sorry, is it specifically to linguistic resources?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, which pronouns do you use? How does the agreement work? You know, how does it work in Spanish? Do you have different choices? What do the possessive adjectives become? You know, kind of like, because I think there are very few, though I know there's one kind of at USC, but there are very few textbooks that include gender inclusive language pronouns. So it's not in the textbooks. So where would educators obtain that information? Do you have for your own languages? As I mentioned, there's for French, there's the Atiyeh, so American Association of Teachers of French. Is there one for your languages that you could direct educators so that they could have that resource at hand and be able to use it?
Sure, and I don't know if I have you know, not necessarily the best answer for Spanish, but what I've done is to sort of seek out those communities in those target languages, right? So am I able to find LGBTQ plus organizations in Madrid, in Paris, in Quebec, or Montreal, in Mexico City, in whatever the language that we're learning is, you know, and looking at sort of the authentic resources, right, for all of our language educators, right, the authentic resources that we can pull that utilize this language. You know, as has been mentioned, right, you know, we know, or maybe we know that they is not the only non-binary pronoun in English, right? There are dozens. It has emerged as the most commonly used. And so similar with, and I think it was mentioned in one of the question and answer threads earlier, the use of E instead of O or A in Spanish. It is not the only option that is in Spanish, but it does seem to be the one that is emerging the most commonly because it already exists in other structures within the languages. And so yeah, I think as language educators, we need to call on our textbooks to do better across many social justice and DEI topics. You know, not just gender just language, but and you know, as we hear the questions about Yeah, you need to change the textbooks need to be changed, right? And as we hear the questions about assessment, right, there's a conversation about assessment happening. And, one of the things that as I presented on this, people will ask, well, what about the AP exam? What about the stamp test or the Apple test that students are taking to demonstrate their proficiency or receive credit? And I said, in each of these organizations, what I've heard is that what we are looking for is demonstration of consistent communicative ability, right? And so if the use of or Atiyeh and gender neutral adjectives and pronouns and such in Spanish is used consistently and coherently, then the skill is being demonstrated, right? And we know that the official bodies, don't recognize this language, but we know that it is being used, and so use it.
If I could, I would also just echo what Joseph said is, as an English speaker myself, in my high school, what I am doing for myself to educate myself about this language, which is continually developing. Language is a living thing. So what I'm doing for the English language to stay current with our students is I am reaching out to those communities. Thank goodness for the internet, because textbooks, as we know, have quite a process of approval and printing and being acceptable for use. So they're not as current as the language obviously is. So reaching out to those communities and for those resources online, and then in those languages, in Russian, reaching out to those communities in the Russian pages, the French pages, etc. Even just pronouns.com is a great resource. But of course, that's the English version that I'm going to. Transgendered youth resources online. But of course, again, that's in English. So reaching out directly to those communities and recognizing that it is developing continuously. And we are going to have to adapt and develop ourselves, continuously learning along with our students.
Absolutely. And I think in some languages, as you mentioned, Laurie, it's kind of easier maybe in English. And as Ben said, when he had questions, he put the question out and received a lot of insults in return. So it's a lot more difficult for certain languages than for others. I'm not sure about what it's like for East Asian languages, for example, and we don't have anyone on the panel to represent that.
If I could just say one other thing, I do want to point out to everyone that reaching out to members of the community, of the LGBTQIA community for help with this is certainly terrific. I definitely encourage this. However, also do so, please, discreetly, and understanding that certain cultures, and again, I teach one of them, are pervasively homophobic and transphobic, and legally. And so, for instance, I have no way to reach out to people in the Russian Federation on this topic right now, because to do so would be to put them at risk, especially in the context of the war against Ukraine and the enhanced degree of surveillance that is currently the situation in the Russian Federation. That being said, I absolutely want to reinforce what Laurie just said about how we model the fact that even if we're native speakers of our target language, that we continue to learn. You know, my kids who are 30 and 28 years old are teaching me new things about the English language all the time. And I'm certainly continuing to learn Russian each day, but I want to model to my students that they'll never be done learning the language, because the language will continue to change, and pointing out to them ways in which English is changing so that they can be understanding and excited about manifestation of changing language in their own lives. Certainly in my experience, while perhaps many of my colleagues have been very resistant to the issue of thinking about inclusive language in the teaching of Russian, my students are not resistant to it. They embrace it. and they're excited about it. Now, I don't teach in a religious institution. I'm not teaching at Liberty University. I wouldn't take a job there. But that's my environment. And so the students are happy and excited. And I think that just reinforces the positivity of we embrace one another in the fullness of who each of us is.
Absolutely. It really kind of underscores, I would almost say, the high stakes when you speak about Russia and the politics and the government, and also the needs of our students, and how something that seems in appearance a part of language, you know, kind of simple, carries so much weight and so much importance for both our students and their life, as well as well-being, as well as on the politics front. It's an incredibly profound discussion and topic, which we're, I think, just skimming the surface of it. In the short time that we have left, I wanted to see if you, I know Chris Nicely during his talk before this one addressed a few of the techniques that one can use in class so as to present a more gender inclusive language, which does, and so he gave the examples of French, which are not necessarily how one would always speak in French, but it's a great way of bringing that forward. So great strategies to be able to do so. I was wondering, just to kind of end, as to, how have you adapted your language class? What does gender inclusive teaching look like in your classroom? What kind of adaptations have you made? If you could kind of briefly address that, I think we're coming near the end of our talk. Yes, Karrie.
Obviously not language courses, but just teaching in general. Making sure my instructional team, everyone has their pronouns listed on the syllabus. I send out a private Google form to get that information I mentioned when I spoke earlier. So I ask for go by names, also how to pronounce names. And I'm sorry, I get foiled by people who change, you know, what looks like Ashley, but then it's like Ashly, you know, like no vowel in English can be taken for granted anymore. So I find that tool extremely helpful for being able to start on the right foot on the first day of class. So I send this out usually a week or two before the semester starts. Again, asking for those layers of communication. How do you want me to address you in front of others? How do you want me to, is this the same in private? You know, just getting those consent layers, again, even with adult learners. I think the other thing in kind of coaching folks, I do a lot of training at the university level around this, is also if you're gonna add your pronouns to your Zoom name, your email signatures, and do all of those performative pieces, to understand the responsibility that comes with that. Because what I see a lot of folks do is like, oh, we're supposed to do this, plunk. And then, you know, they don't look at the pronouns on other Zoom names and they misgender people in meetings, or they don't. So you're indicating safety to the community when you do those behaviors. You're flagging that you are okay, and then you might perpetrate harm. And I will just say, as a member of the community, that harm is harder to take than someone who doesn't indicate that they are someone who appears to know what they're doing and then they don't. So it sets you up in some way. You think you're safe and then there's a drop. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you, Karrie, for being so sincere and honest and open about your experiences. It's I know it's probably difficult to talk about, it's difficult to hear, but you've gone through. So thank you so much for sharing all that. Laurie, Joseph, Ben, would you have anything to add?
Well, I would echo absolutely what Karrie was saying, and asking those questions, getting that information as early as possible in the school year. I think the other thing for our teachers at the 9-12 is doing everything they can to eliminate those the group pronouns that categorize everyone into one gender. and being more non-gendered with their pronouns, just in that general use, and instead of the as you mentioned earlier, that the default in English is to the masculine, and the teachers referring to the class as, hey guys, let's go. That sort of generalized language, and calling it out to our teachers early on in the school year to try to eliminate that use, and sharing best practices for what can we use instead that honors all students in your classroom from the get-go.
I would agree with everything that's been said before. And in fact, I just want to point out that I have rarely spoken on a panel where I have agreed more consistently with every other speaker. So I thank my colleagues here. I just want to say that the challenge with the use of they in French and Spanish, for instance, which is gendered, is one of those highly unusual moments in the Russian grammar where it's not an issue. So the plural has no gender. So this is one of those moments that is easier. For strategies for professors of Russian, I think it's really important to begin with awareness of the issue, to read and to discover what individuals in the LGBTQIA community who speak Russian are doing, and to make those strategies available to your students, and to talk about what it means to make one or another choice. As Evgeny mentioned in the chat, some students prefer to do one thing in Russian and others prefer to do another. And my role as a professor in this context is to be supportive of my students making their choices, and not to dictate to them, you know, I want you to do this or I want you to do that. I want them to do what feels right for them. In the same way that I don't require my students to take a Russian name. If they want to take a Russian name, of course, fine, go ahead. And if you don't. That's, it's your identity. You get to define it how you wish, and how that changes and evolves. We have other fish to fry here, and I want everybody to feel welcome and supported. And I'm going to make mistakes, and so are you, and we're all going to learn together. So that's what I would recommend. That's the strategy I would recommend to all faculty teaching all languages.
Thank you. I think those are wonderful comments to kind of end uplifting, also, in a sense, gender affirming, and we all have our identities that we assume as we want, and hopefully society will always recognize that. I do have a request here from Diana Ruggiero for Karrie, and she says, could you please share the form you mentioned? If that would be possible, I think it would give, it's a great way for everyone.
I just create a Google form, so I don't know if I can find that link fast enough, but I was typing an answer where I'm listing the questions I put into the Google form.
Okay. Maybe as inspiration, and what it would give ideas to our attendees. If it's something that you could then later share with Evgeny, he'd be able to then post it to the site or so. So it would give everyone idea, especially how you word the question, how you formulate it, to make sure that that would be
okay.
Very
yeah,
helpful.
I will do that. Does that work for you, Diana, to find it later?
Right. Okay, great. So I think we've gone through a number of questions. There's one here that has been added into the chat that was also a question that was asked. We have like 2 minutes. That was asked during the keynote presentation earlier today. And the question, I'll read it verbatim, which is, please comment on how we prepare students to be mocked, say in France, for using non-binary terms. Sadly, it's a strong likelihood. Would somebody like to address that question directly?
Can I just chime in real quick and say that I think it's so funny when we get this rigidity around something that's a social construction, right? Like language is true. Yeah, I'm not a linguist, but language is a cultural tool, right? And it changes and it evolves over time. Otherwise, we wouldn't keep using it if it wasn't relevant, right? It has to grow. So I think it's just so odd to me that people are going to resist, and I don't think people should respond if it's unsafe or hateful. But I think prepping your students in the languages you teach with clever comebacks about how that language is already involved would be something I would coach them to have that ready if they want to have that conversation, but also recognizing that people who are going to give you a hard time sometimes aren't ready to learn.
I know it's a concern for a number of, I've heard this concern from a number of educators, especially in languages where, and I think Spanish, the Romance languages, where you hear the adjective masculine, feminine, and now the non-binary. And yet, and so students get used to saying I am, and whatever adjective it is. So the I, you know, for me, it would be female. For somebody, it would be males. For somebody, it would be non-binary. So you choose the pronoun and the adjective that goes with it. And yet in France, those adjectives are not recognized. So I heard, you know, a number of strategies presented saying, I am a person like this, or I'm someone who is, to avoid using a grammatical gender for it. But that comes strange in France. And I think that's where the question, I don't know about other languages, but it is something I think students just need to be maybe warned about, so that when they are in the country, well, they're because it's something that most people don't recognize, or many people don't recognize. So I understand where that question comes from, which is something that's been asked a number of times. But we're at the end of our panel. I'd really like to thank you so much, our panelists. These are kind of hard questions to address, very important questions for our students, for us as educators, what we do in the classroom, how we work with our students, and how we give them the support they need. So thank you so much for taking on some difficult questions and a difficult subject. And it was really, for me, an enlightening discussion and hearing your responses to everything. So I'd like to thank you very much, Karrie, Joseph, Laurie, and Ben, for your participation in this important panel. Thank you. And I'll add that we'll be taking a 10-minute break and then coming back in about 10 minutes at 11:20 for the next session, whose title is A Case Study, Swedish and Finnish. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll see you at the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.